Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is the graphic novelization of Creepshow. Now, this is a graphic novel written by Stephen King and illustrated by Bernie Wrightson and Michele Wrightson, and this, of course, is based on the 1982 anthology-horror film Creepshow, which was written by Stephen King and directed by George A. Romero. And that movie was made as Stephen King and George A. Romero's tribute to the EC comic books of the 1950s. So comic books like Tales from the Crypt, The Vault of Horror, and The Haunt of Fear. And two of the segments in the movie Creepshow were actually based on short stories by Stephen King, Weeds and The Crate. Now, this graphic novel was published in 1982, the same year as the movie, and Stephen King wrote this to tie in with the movie. Now, Creepshow is one of my all-time favorite movies, and for the most part, I would say this graphic novel is pretty true to the movie. The only major difference is the movie had a wraparound story that sort of tied the 5 stories together. This does not have that wraparound story. Also, the order of the stories is a little different in the graphic novel than it is in the movie. For example, in the movie, the Something That Tied You Over segment came before the Crate segment. However, in this graphic novel, the Crate segment comes before the Something That Tied You Over segment. Now, very much like the movie, this is 5 stories in one. Father's Day, The Lonesome Death of Jordy Verrill, The Crate, Something That Tied You Over, and They're Creeping Up on You. And for the most part, the stories in this comic are pretty straightforward adaptations of their counterparts in the movie. Now, the first story in this book is Father's Day, and this is about this really rich family who is having a get-together for Father's Day, minus the father in question, and they're waiting for this woman who is pretty much the matriarch of this family, Aunt Bedelia, and it turns out that 7 years prior to the events of this story, Bedelia murdered her father, who was extremely abusive towards her, but also her father hired a hitman to kill her fiancé when he found out about this fiancé, so out of vengeance, she killed her father, but now it's 7 years later, and it turns out that every Father's Day she returns to her father's grave to put flowers on the grave, but once again, it's 7 years later, and long story short, her father ends up coming back from the dead as a zombie and killing her, and then he starts going after all the other members of this family, and it's a really good story in both the movie and in the graphic novel. Now, in this story, in both the movie and in the comic, you actually do feel a lot of sympathy for Bedelia, because even though she murdered her father, you don't really blame her for what she did. Her father was extremely psychologically abusive towards her, and also her father had her fiancé murdered, so you don't blame her for snapping and killing her father, so you do sympathize with Bedelia, but she's really the only sympathetic character in this story. The other characters in this story are just so uptight, and you kind of get the idea that they care more about money and status than they even do about each other. So, in this story, you do get sort of a commentary on greed. Now, the second story is The Lonesome Death of Jordy Verrill, and this is actually based on a short story by Stephen King titled Weeds. Now, this is about this farmer named Jordy Verrill who comes off as a very nice, sweet man, but he's also not the sharpest tool in the shed by any means, and what happens is this meteor lands happens right in his farm, and he thinks he can make money off this, so he pours water on it to cool it off, and all of a sudden the meteor cracks open, and this alien ooze comes out of the meteor. He gets some on his fingers, but wipes it off, thinking nothing of it, but it turns out that this alien ooze is actually causing these alien weeds to grow out of his hand, and they're spreading throughout his entire body, and are literally turning him into a human weed, and all these weeds are also growing from the crater. It's a really good story. Now, in the movie, Stephen King actually played the character of Jordy Verrill, and he was freaking hilarious in the movie. Like, it's actually a really funny story, despite the fact that you do feel so bad for the character of Jordy Verrill, because he does not deserve what's happening to him, but because of what's happening to him, because he's such a funny character, his situation somehow ends up being hilarious, despite the fact that you do feel bad for him. And this story could very much be looked at as a body horror story. Also, because I'm so familiar with the movie, I found myself, when I was reading, like, the speech bubbles in this, I found myself reading it in Stephen King's voice, the way Stephen King played Jordy Verrill in the movie. I ended up doing that for pretty much all the stories in this. Like, I ended up reading them in the actor's voice, the way the actors said these lines in the movie, even though the dialogue in the comic is slightly different than the dialogue in the movie. Now, the third story in the graphic novel is The Crate. Now, in the movie, it's the fourth segment, but for some reason in the graphic novel, they made it the third segment. Now, this is actually based on a short story by Stephen King of the same name. Now, The Crate in both the movie and in the graphic novel, I think is the best out of the 5 stories, and I also think it's the deepest of the 5 stories. Like, I actually do think there's a lot of subtext in this story. Now, the plot of The Crate is it's about this college professor named Dexter Stanley who gets this phone call from this janitor who works at his college who found this crate underneath a stairwell, and apparently this crate has been there since the year 1834, so over 100 years it's been there. So Dexter Stanley goes to the college campus, and him and this janitor open the crate up, and they find an ape-like monster living in the crate, and it turns out that this monster has been living in this crate for over 100 years, and the monster eats the janitor, and then it eats a college student, so Dexter runs off to his best friend Henry, who is also a college professor, and tells him about this. Now, Henry has this really abusive wife named Wilma, and it turns out that he's had fantasies of killing Wilma, and when he finds out about this monster, he decides to use this monster as the thing to help him kill Wilma. And I feel like in this story, the monster is really a representation of Henry's own savagery, pretty much, because this guy is fantasizing about killing his wife, and now he has this thing to help him kill his wife, and I feel like the monster is supposed to be a representation of Henry's own inner savagery. Now, Henry is still a sympathetic character because you realize he takes a lot of abuse from his wife Wilma, and Wilma is a complete bitch, but I also don't think Wilma necessarily deserves to die. Frankly, I just think these two people need a goddamn divorce, but once again, Henry kind of feels stuck in this really abusive marriage, and this monster is almost like his only way out. You could also look at the story as being sort of a commentary on masculinity, or sort of this failed notion of masculinity. But The Crate is an excellent story in both the movie and in the comic book, and I've never read the original short story that both the segment from the movie and the segment from this comic were based on, but I would really like to read the original Crate story one day. Now, something that I thought was a really creepy coincidence is, in both the movie and in the comic, I don't know if it was in the original Crate story or not, because, once again, I've never read the original Crate story, but in both the movie and the comic, the date on the crate says June 19th, 1834. Now, June 19th ended up becoming a pretty significant date in Stephen King's life, because on June 19th, 1999, Stephen King was hit by that car. So I thought that was really creepy that Stephen King made the date June 19th a significant date in one of his stories, and then years later, that ended up being a significant date in his actual life. That's a really creepy coincidence, but I don't know how well you can see it, but right there on the crate it says June 19th, 1834. Now, later on in Stephen King's Dark Tower series, specifically in the final 3 Dark Tower novels, which he wrote after that accident, Stephen King actually made the date June 19th a significant date in the Dark Tower mythos. So if you wanted to tie this story into his Dark Tower mythos, that you probably could do that, but once again, at the time he wrote this, he had no idea that that date would end up having any significance in his actual life. So once again, it's a really creepy coincidence. Now, the 4th story in the book is Something That Tied You Over, and this is about this man who discovers that his wife was cheating on him, and he ends up killing his wife and her lover in a really elaborate way. Basically, he buries them at the beach up to their heads in sand, and they can't move, and the tide comes in and drowns them. But what happens is they end up coming back from the dead to get revenge on him. It's the classic EC story, because once again, the EC Tales from the Crypt comic books had a huge influence on Stephen King when he made this movie and when he made this comic, and really this story, I would say, is the most EC-ish of all the 5 stories, because a lot of the old Tales from the Crypt stories dealt with revenge from the grave. But in both the movie and in the comic, this is a really good story. And the final story in this comic is They're Creeping Up on You, which is definitely the creepiest of the 5 stories. Now, this is about this ruthless businessman named Hudson Pratt, who you realize has really screwed a lot of people over, and he's just a bad man. But what happens is his apartment ends up getting infested with cockroaches, and it becomes apparent that these are not normal cockroaches. It appears these cockroaches might be supernatural in nature, and they're also flesh-eating. But in both the movie and in the comic, They're Creeping Up on You is a fantastic story, and in the story, like, you don't sympathize with Hudson Pratt at all. Like, he's a bad guy, and he really does kind of deserve what he's getting, and you could almost read these cockroaches as almost being like God's punishment on him for how he's treated other people. But overall, I could definitely say I recommend this graphic novel. However, I will say I almost recommend the movie more, because once again, this is based on the movie, so I recommend watching the movie first and then checking out this graphic novel, because I can't really say I recommend this if you've never seen the movie, because once again, most of the stories in here are pretty straightforward adaptations of the stories from the movie, so you almost might as well just watch the movie. However, if you are a Creepshow fan, I definitely recommend getting this graphic novel. And Bernie Wrightson's artwork in this comic is actually quite beautiful, and he really does capture the look and feel of the movie with his artwork. And Bernie Wrightson, he was one of the co-creators of Swamp Thing, but he actually ended up working with Stephen King again. Like, he ended up doing the illustrations for Stephen King's novella Cycle of the Werewolf, and he also did the illustrations for the illustrated version of Wolves of the Kala, which was the fifth Dark Tower novel. So it seems like Stephen King and Bernie Wrightson ended up having a pretty close working relationship after this. But once again, I do recommend the graphic novelization of Creepshow. However, I recommend it more if you're a fan of the movie Creepshow. If you haven't seen the movie Creepshow yet, I recommend seeing that movie first and then reading this comic. But yeah, that's my review on the graphic novelization of Creepshow, and bye.